that's a very generous introduction. I'd like to meet this fellow. Now, to be honest, let's put our cards on the table. I have the sense that really my best qualification for being invited to speak today is that I'm married to a Polish and American librarian. I sort of have the sense that the discussion about choosing the speaker went somewhere along the lines of, well, he shows up every year to eat the food anyway. We might as well, have him work for his keep. So anyway, here I am, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor. As Leonard will have told you, I am a faculty member of the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and what I do primarily is teach modern European history, specifically modern Polish history, and if you really had to get narrow about it, in specific, Poland of the 20th century. And that's what I've been asked to talk about today. What was the title? There were a lot of T's in there. The turbulent, triumphant, tragic history of Poland in the 20th century, and how librarians and libraries can help tell the story. Well, first of all, I've got a PowerPoint here, and I kind of threw it together, and I'm going to use some of the pictures. I think I'm going to do some, I was thinking about on the way driving down from out of state this afternoon, and I thought, well, maybe I can pare it down a bit, and I will bet that after that delicious lunch, there will not be too many people out there who will be disappointed to hear that I intend to talk shorter rather than longer. So I will use some of the pictures, but I hope it's not too distracting if I sort of run through those. Now, first of all, there's a challenge involved here. I'm supposed to talk about two things. I'm supposed to talk about the history of Poland in the 20th century, which is fine, but there are audiences and then there are audiences. And in front of an audience as knowledgeable as this, I don't imagine that much of what I'm going to say about 20th century Poland will come as much of a revelation to you. So I will take some of that for granted, try to hit the high points and simply remind you of some of the things you already know. And if you have questions afterwards that you'd like me to talk about further, I will be happy to do that. But I'm going to try to err on the side of economy on that. The other part that I need to talk about is the library component. The history of 20th century Poland, how libraries and librarians can help tell the story. Well, I'm preaching to the choir here. And I don't think that it would take much convincing for that. So, but what I want to do is, I think that when we're among ourselves, it's easy enough for us to say, well, of course we should be interested in Poland. Right? We're interested in Poland because many of us, not all of us, are Polish or we are of Polish ancestry. So we have that going for us. We have that built in. And that's not a hard sell. But part of what we're talking about here is, how do we broaden this audience? How do we get the message out to people who aren't part already by birth, heritage, whatever of that? How do we make the story of Poland known to a wider public, and how do we get them interested in finding out about it? And I think that is the challenge, and that's what I want to talk about. Maybe how we can talk about the history of Poland so we're not just talking to ourselves, but we're trying to convince people who don't have a natural built-in interest in the subject why they should take an interest in it. Right? This is something that you have to do all the time when you're teaching these courses in a university, right? I mean, you offer these courses, and you're going to get a fair number of students sign up because their name ends in ski or whatever. But you can't build a course out of just those, right? You have to bring in other people. And I've got an answer. Doesn't work for everybody, but it works for me, because I think it's true. And it works often enough that the courses keep going. So anyway, that's what I want to do. So let me talk just a bit about the 20th century, history of the 20th century, and particularly Poland's role in 20th century history. And then move on to some sort of general comments on that. First of all, here we go. This is what we're talking about, and you know that. This is what Poland looks like today. Contemporary Poland, or the Third Polish Republic, as it is sometimes called. Let's see. And that's the place that it occupies in Europe. It's a very medium-sized country, occupying a part of Europe that traditionally English speakers, people living in the United States, United Kingdom, haven't paid that much attention to. There is a long-standing tendency in the English-speaking world to think of Poland and the area around Poland as being sort of out there, sort of obscure. Why should we care? Well, we'll go on to that a little later. Now, you know, this audience knows that this isn't what Poland has looked like throughout all of its history. Throughout much of its history, it looked more like this. This situation here. For about 800 years, since the foundation of Poland in the 10th century, Poland occupied a prominent place on the map of Europe as occasionally the largest and one of the most interesting and prominent countries of East Central Europe. Now, by the time the 20th century begins, this is what Poland looked like, or rather the absence of Poland. This kingdom of Poland you have here was, of course, an administrative fiction of the Russian Empire, because, as you all know, in the 18th century, the lands of the old Commonwealth were partitioned among the three empires of Russia, Prussia, soon to become Germany, and the Habsburg Empire. Now, when we think of the 20th century, it's not, when people like me start talking about the 20th century, we don't tend to mean literally 1901 to 2000, right? That's arithmetic. When modern European historians talk about the 20th century, they're more often apt to talk of it in terms of its being a short century. One that, in a sense, actually begins in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War, and that ends about 75 years later, around 1989, 1990, 1991. Take any one of those dates and just mix it up and pick out whichever one you want. But what you're really looking for is the end of the Cold War, which in many ways just indicates the end of the long chain of historical events, calamities, tragedies, what have you, that came out of the Pandora's box that was introduced into Europe and the world by the outbreak of the Great War of 1914. The Great War, in a sense, was sort of like the big boom of modern history that just sort of sent fragments out for decades and decades until they more or less came to rest around the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s. And Poland played a very significant part in the story of the European 20th century. Let's tick down the ways. Well, here's the way that Europe looked around 1914 with the outbreak of the Great War, the First World War. And for our purposes, what we need to remember is that during the First World War, the greatest war the world had known up to that point in history, All three of the partitioning empires that had conquered and dominated Poland collapsed in defeat and revolution, and one of the consequences was the return to the map of Europe of an independent Poland for the first time in 123 years, the so-called Second Polish Republic. This republic was born into a Europe that was not stabilized or pacified by the end of the First World War. As a matter of fact, the 1920s, the 1930s, the period in which the Second Polish Republic tried to get on its feet, was one of the more difficult times in modern history and would lead to an even greater calamity just 2 decades down the line. In terms of historical significance, the main event of the 1920s and the 1930s was the rise of the 2 great dictatorships poised on either side of the new Poland and inimical to Poland in many ways. German Nazism to the west and Soviet communism to the east. And it would be these dictatorships that, unfortunately for Poland and for humanity as a whole, would dictate the pace of 20th century history for decades to come. One thing this did was to pitch Poland into the midst of what Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University has called the bloodlands. The areas in East Central Europe between Germany and Soviet Union in which the combined efforts, if we can call it those, of the 2 dictators led to the wanton murders of at least 14 million people and countless more millions dying as the result of wars or other inhumanly ambitious, to put it mildly, projects of human engineering on either side. One consequence of this, of course, was the outbreak of the Second World War, which was begun, fittingly enough, by a deal between the 2 dictators that foresaw the invasion and partition of Poland. Second World War, the greatest war the world has known up to this point, thank you, began, of course, with an attack on Poland from both sides in 1939 and threw Poland into the maelstrom of the Second World War. It is arguable that no country has suffered so much in modern war as Poland between 1939 and 1945. About 1/6 of the Polish population perished as a result of the war. Some of this was at the hands of Soviet occupiers. You're all aware of the Katyn massacre. I'll return to that in a few minutes, but most of the bloodshed in Poland had to do with the insane ambitions of the Nazi tyranny, which foresaw Poland as part of the greater German Empire. It would have to be subdued, conquered, exploited, and quote-unquote racially purified according to Nazi standards. This made Poland, among other things, the main site of what we now call the Holocaust, the annihilation of the great mass of European Jewry, which unfortunately has left many people in the world with images such as these as their primary impressions of Poland and its history. The loadings for deportation to Treblinka and other places, the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Rising, and the like. Poland fought bravely during the Second World War, but ended up falling victim to larger circumstances, including the difficulties of the victorious wartime alliance, which of course included the Western democracies, along with, in a terrible irony, the Soviet Union itself. And the Polish question in Poland itself became, in a sense, sacrificed to the larger priorities of the Allied cause. The Warsaw Rising of 1944, to which we heard reference a few minutes ago, stands as testimony to that. No need to rehearse the story, but worth reminding that, on September 11th, 2001, the United States lost 3,000 victims to terrorism. The Warsaw Rising, which lasted for 2 months without effective assistance from outside, was the equivalent of a 9/11 every day for 63 days. This is a fact that much of the world does not take cognizance of, but one that Poles are very aware of. The Poland that emerged from war, the end of war in 1945, in many ways was symbolized by its ravaged capital, as Warsaw looked in 1945 at the end of the ordeal. And of course, Poland was officially a victor in the war, and God preserve any country from the sort of victory that we have. Poland's reward was the loss of much of its historic territory in the east at the behest of the main victor of the war on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, and the forcible inclusion of Poland and its neighboring countries, much against its will, into what became known as the Soviet bloc, forcibly brought into a status of being a component of Soviet empire in the East, and as I say, part of the Soviet bloc and the Cold War. The communist interlude of 4.5 decades was one of repression, dictatorship, misery, economic plight. This is a picture that all of us will be familiar of as to the rigors of daily life in Poland. The cost of a people suffering under an unwanted dictatorship and struggling for its freedom, but then eventually emerging victorious. Key components in this being the election of a Polish pope of the Catholic Church in the 1970s, the rise of solidarity at the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s, the detour into martial law in the early 1980s, but then the return of democracy with the Polish elections of 1989 that brought the first post-communist government to Poland, and also inspired a similarly peaceful revolution in the rest of Soviet Europe. The key role of Poland in this is, again, often forgotten in the outside world. The rollback of communism in Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War, and the reemergence of Poland as a sovereign, thriving, democratic nation, and one of the leaders in what is becoming the very difficult circumstances of independent nationhood in the eastern zones of Europe. Okay, now what does this all add up to? And why should people care? Because if you go down this list of all the events in which the seemingly smallish, obscure country has played an outsized role, the First World War, the rise of the great dictatorships of our era, the Second World War, the Holocaust, the rise and the end of the Cold War. No country has been closer to the heart of these as Poland. my graduate advisor when I was doing my doctoral work, Piotr Bondage, some of you will know the name, very eminent Polish historian in the United States. I remember once he said, and I never forgot this, said that he called Poland the laboratory of modern history. And that stuck with me. In other words, what did he mean? That is the place where the great issues of modern history have found their focus, where they have been felt with the fullest intensity. Now, this is not always, this doesn't make for any easy history at all. One's reminded of the joke that Abraham Lincoln used to tell about the man who was being run out of town on the rail. And he said, well, what's it like? Well, apart from the honor, I'd rather walk, thank you. You know? One could imagine easier ways of going through the 20th century and its history than that Poland had to go through. But as instruction, it powerfully focuses the attention. Another way that I try to tell my students this is that, look, it's like this. Poland, paradoxically, is both exceptional and universal. It is both. Why? It is universal in that if you study the history of modern Poland, you sort of get an idea of understanding what has made the history of the world in the 20th century tick. So it's universal in that respect. But it's exceptional in that arguably no other country has had the intensity of the experience of Poland in the 20th century, sort of laser-like. I recall that Pope John Paul II, in the famous sermon that he gave on Victory Square in Warsaw in 1979, talked about Poland as being a country of, I forget the exact wording, particularly compelling or responsible witness to the world. And in a sense, that's what the history of Poland in the 20th century has been. It has been the way that a country has mirrored to the rest of humanity its most important, its most tragic, and in some cases its most inspiring and compelling issues. So that, I think, is the main story of the history of Poland in the 20th century. Now, what do libraries and librarians have to do with this? How am I doing on time? Am I doing okay? Kind of? Okay. All right. I'll try to make the rest of this quick. Well, again, I don't have to convince you, but where do we get history? Where do we get the materials for history? People like me, whose job it is to find out about modern history, to teach it, to lecture about it, to write about it. Where are we going to learn this stuff? Where are we going to find the materials? We need sources. And libraries are where you find them. And in the case of Poland, this is a particular issue because the history of Poland has been such that the holdings that one finds in libraries are scattered widely throughout the world, right? We know this. You know, if you go online and you take a look at lists of archives, libraries that have to do with information about Poland, well, you're going to get basically a laundry list of most countries in Europe and North America. You know, the books that I've written, the articles that I've written, it's not at all uncommon that I will have to it takes a long time to do these things. Why? Because you have to go to 4 or 5 different countries to track down all the materials. And this is important, and it's particularly important in a country like Poland. Because one lesson that the history of Poland teaches you is that Americans have it easy in a lot of ways. We've had a fairly easy history in comparison with many countries in the world. And I talk to American students, and very often they think that the conditions that they think normal in America, they're more or less normal everywhere. Conditions of freedom, free inquiry, access to information, that they're universal. Those of us with any experience in dealing with Europe, or particularly Poland, will know that you can't take this for granted. You can't take even the most basic fact for granted. We will know that when dictatorships try to take over countries, one of the first things they will do is to attempt to conquer history, to commandeer it, to distort it, to use it to their own purposes. I remember, and sometimes even the merest fact can sometimes make the difference. I remember years ago, before 1989, Robert Darnton, who was a distinguished historian at Princeton, came to our university. And Robert Darnton, he wasn't a specialist in Poland or anything like that. He was a specialist in French history, the French Revolution, all that. Doing very interesting stuff, but I kind of showed up to the lecture kind of out of duty more than anything else, right? And all of a sudden I realized he's talking about Poland. Well, wait, what are we doing here? And he was talking about something that had impressed him. He had gone to Poland, and it dawned on him the difference that a single numeral can make. Single numeral in a date. Now, some of you may already know what I'm alluding to. I talked about the Katyn massacre not long ago. And what he was talking about was the discussions that he ran into about whether the Katyn massacre had happened in 1941 or 1940. What difference does it make? Well, it makes all the difference in the world, of course. Because as all of you will know, to the extent that you were allowed to talk about Katyn in the days before 1989 in Poland, you weren't supposed to talk about it. But if you were going to talk about it at all, you had to say that it happened in 1941. Because if it had happened in 1941, then the Russians could not have done it. If you said that it happened in 1940, then only the Russians could have done it. So yes, there's a difference. And sometimes even these minor differences add up. And where are you going to find the materials to counter the myths or the lies or the misconceptions? You will find them in libraries. You will find them in archives. I studied, I'll be quiet in a couple minutes, trust me. But continuing on with the Katyn, I began my, some of you will have heard the name of Anna Chanchawa, who was a professor of history at the University of Kansas. And actually Kansas is, that's my home state. That's my state of birth. And you've already heard, I'm not Polish. How did I get interested in the history of Poland? It was quite by chance. And I just happened to sign up for a course that Anna Cienciała was giving on the history of Poland because a friend of mine was taking it, and the course was given in the afternoon, so I didn't have to get up too early and all of that. And it opened a whole new world for me. Now, Anna Cienciała unfortunately died this past year, but what is she probably best remembered for in historical circles? For the publication of a book back in 2007 that for the first time gave a thorough and irrefutable depiction of the Cotton events based on documents, on solid facts that had resided in archives and libraries for years and years and years, but to which scholars had not been given access. How precious was the discovery, or shall we say, at least the release of those documents. So, a tribute to my old professor, a tribute to the librarians and the libraries who gave her the information and provided her the information to do that. And the work goes on. Because, of course, after 1989, it was fashionable in some circles to say that history had ended. We've gotten sort of a rude awakening in the last year or so that, especially in the east of Europe, history has not ended. It continues. The telling of the story will continue. Probably the degree to which Poland and the countries around Poland have sometimes to their sorrow, often to their glory, reflected with peculiar intensity the main issues of their time, that will go on. And it's a joint responsibility that historians and librarians have and will continue to have. And for your services in pursuit of that, my heartfelt thanks.